6 ships. That's how many vessels turned back in the first 24 hours after the United States Navy sealed off Iran's ports in April 2026. Not sunk, not seized, just turned around, one by one, after running into a wall of American warships that hadn't existed a week earlier. Somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, tanker captains who'd made the same run 100 times were suddenly being told to reverse course by a military force that had materialized almost overnight. More than 10,000 troops and over a dozen warships, according to U.S. Central Command. What nobody watching those ships turn back yet knew was whether this was the beginning of a short, symbolic show of force, or the opening chapter of something that would drag on for months, spread across 3 countries, and eventually come apart and reassemble itself more than once before anyone could say how it ends. To understand how a chunk of one of the world's most important waterways ended up under total American control, you have to back up a few months. Because this didn't start with the blockade. It started with a war. By early 2026, tensions between the United States and Iran had been building for years, but they broke open fast. Starting in late January, the U.S. began a significant military buildup across the Middle East, moving carrier strike groups, special operations units, airborne divisions, and marine expeditionary forces into the region in a matter of weeks. By the end of February, that buildup had culminated in joint military strikes on Iran. Carried out by the United States and Israel together, the campaign that followed had a name, Operation Epic Fury, and it was not small. By late March, CENTCOM said American forces had hit more than 10,000 targets inside Iran since the operation began on February 28th, and the U.S. military's own count of the campaign's effects was staggering. According to the command's own numbers, 92% of the large ships in the Iranian Navy had been eliminated by that point, a claim delivered by the CENTCOM commander himself. War, though, doesn't move in one direction. Iran struck back. In late March, a ballistic missile hit Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, injuring a dozen Americans. A strike that involved Iranian ballistic missiles and drones, according to a regional source. This wasn't a contained, one-sided operation. It was a real, escalating war, spilling across borders into Saudi Arabia, and it was in the middle of that chaos that the idea of a blockade first started to surface. Not as a headline yet, but as a rumor moving through defense circles. And the reason a blockade was even on the table says a lot about why this particular stretch of ocean matters so much in the first place. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just another shipping lane. It's a bottleneck barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point, squeezed between Iran on one side and Oman on the other, and through that narrow gap flows an almost unbelievable share of the world's energy. Around 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade transits the strait, and the options to bypass it are extremely limited. In 2024, an estimated 20.3 million barrels of oil moved through the passage every single day, representing roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. It isn't only oil, either. Around 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade also travels through this same corridor, which matters enormously for countries like Qatar that depend on it to reach their customers. And when you look at who's actually receiving all that oil, the picture gets even more pointed. China alone receives 37.7% of all oil exports that pass through the strait, more than any other country. And Asian countries as a whole take in nearly 90% of the crude oil and condensate that flows through it. So when someone talks about blockading this stretch of water, they aren't just talking about a regional military maneuver. They're talking about a lever that touches fuel prices, shipping costs, and energy, security on the other side of the planet. That's exactly what started happening almost immediately once the shooting began. In the last week of February 2026, just before the conflict erupted, the shares of global seaborne trade passing through the strait stood at 38% for crude oil, 29% for liquefied. Petroleum gas, 19% for liquefied natural gas, and 13% for chemicals, including fertilizers. Within days, those numbers collapsed. By March 10th, the number of ships transiting the strait had dropped from an average of 129 per day to just 4, a decline of roughly 97%. Britannica's own accounting of the war noted that immediately after the outbreak of fighting, about 90% of traffic through the strait diverted to avoid any chance of hostilities, and when Iran threatened to attack ships days later, that number climbed above 95%. Oil markets reacted instantly. Brent crude jumped roughly 10%. In a single trading session, crossing $82 a barrel, as one major German shipping group suspended all vessel transit through the strait until further notice. By the time analysts at CSIS were compiling their own assessment of the conflict months later, they described the waterway plainly. The strait had been effectively closed since March 2nd, following the initial U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. That's the backdrop the blockade eventually stepped into. Not calm water suddenly disrupted, but an already chaotic shipping lane that had spent weeks trading normally at over 100 vessels a day down to a handful. By late March, reporting suggested the Pentagon was weighing something bigger than airstrikes to lock that disruption in permanently, at least where Iran itself was concerned. The Wall Street Journal reported that the Pentagon was considering sending up to 10,000 additional U.S. troops to the Middle East during the operation, according to a senior defense official. Around the same time, CENTCOM announced that a task force of 3,500 Marines and sailors aboard the USS Tripoli had arrived in the region. The America-class amphibious assault ship serving as flagship for the Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. That single group alone carried transport and strike aircraft, along with amphibious assault and tactical equipment. And crucially, sources at the time said the incoming forces were expected to be positioned within striking distance of Iran, including near its critical oil export hub on Karg Island. In other words, this wasn't a defensive posture. This was a force being built for something specific, and the target, Iran's ability to move oil, was already becoming clear before anyone in Washington said the word blockade out loud. Then, on a Sunday in April, the ambiguity ended. President Trump announced that the U.S. Navy would blockade the Strait of Hormuz, a corridor, whose importance, by this point in the story, needs no further explaining. There is no easy detour around it. Ships that wanted to avoid it entirely would eventually have to consider sailing all the way around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks and enormous fuel costs to a voyage that would normally take a fraction of the time. Geography, in this conflict, was doing almost as much work as either military. The blockade wasn't a slow rollout. It began the following Monday morning, applying to all vessels coming from or going to Iranian ports, and the numbers behind it were extraordinary for what amounted to a naval and air operation announced with barely 48 hours' notice. More than 10,000 American sailors, Marines, and Air Force personnel took part, backed by more than 12 warships and dozens of aircraft. CENTCOM said the operation also involved upwards of 100 fighter and surveillance aircraft. This was not a symbolic gesture parked offshore for the cameras. It was a full-scale interdiction force built to physically stop maritime traffic in and out of an entire country's coastline. And CENTCOM was careful, publicly, about how it described the rules of engagement. The command stressed that the blockade was being enforced equally against vessels from every country, not just Iranian-flagged ships, covering Iranian ports across both the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. At the same time, it maintained that U.S. forces continued to support freedom of navigation for any vessel transiting the strait that wasn't headed to or from an Iranian port. The distinction mattered enormously for the global economy. This wasn't meant to strangle Hormuz entirely, just the traffic connected to Iran itself. Whether that distinction held up in practice is where the story gets more complicated. Within the first day, the results looked decisive. CENTCOM reported that no ship entered or exited Iranian ports during the entire first 24 hours of the operation, and 6 merchant ships that had attempted to leave complied with U.S. orders and turned back toward Iranian ports on the Gulf of Oman. CENTCOM even took to social media to broadcast the numbers directly, writing that during the first 24 hours, no ships made it past the blockade, and 6 merchant vessels complied with direction from U.S. forces to re-enter an Iranian port. For a military operation announced days earlier, it was an almost eerily clean start. Total compliance, 0 breaches. The kind of statistic that makes for a dramatic first headline, and also the kind of statistic that rarely stays perfect for long once a country under blockade starts looking for ways around it. It didn't stay perfect. Within just another day, cracks started to show. Maritime intelligence data, this time not from the U.S. military, but from an independent tracking firm called Kepler, told a slightly different story. At least 2 vessels that had departed Iranian ports were tracked crossing the Strait of Hormuz the day after the blockade supposedly took effect. One of them, a Liberian-flagged cargo ship called the Christiana, crossed the strait after unloading cargo at an Iranian port. The other, a Comoros-flagged tanker called the Elpis, already under U.S. sanctions, had left the Iranian port of Bushehr on March 31st and also made the crossing. So even in the operation's opening days, independent tracking was picking up traffic the U.S. military's own public statements hadn't mentioned. Not necessarily a contradiction. Ships can slip through even a heavily patrolled corridor, and 2 vessels against a total blockade of an entire coastline is still an overwhelming success rate. But it was an early sign of something that would define the whole operation going forward. The gap between what a blockade announces itself to be and what actually gets through. That gap only grew. Zoom out to the full run of what's now documented as the initial phase of this blockade, and the numbers tell a story of leakage, not lockdown. According to a Congressional Research Service report tracking The operation during the initial blockade, which lasted through mid-June, CENTCOM reported having redirected over 140 ships and disabling 9 that didn't comply. A separate tally, cited on the Wikipedia summary of the event and attributed to Lloyd's List, the maritime industry's own tracking authority, put the number of vessels that managed to bypass the blockade altogether at 26. 26 ships slipping past what was supposed to be a total unbroken wall of American naval power, and CENTCOM's own figures claimed 85 vessels intercepted, 3 ships seized, and a cost to Iran of roughly $500 million a day. That's the tension sitting right at the center of this story. Was this blockade an overwhelming, near-total success, or a leaky one, patched together well enough to inflict real economic pain on Iran, but never quite airtight? And Iran didn't just sit and absorb the pressure. In retaliation, Iran seized 2 cargo ships of its own. A reminder that a blockade in a body of water, this contested, isn't a one-way action. It's a provocation, and provocations in the Gulf have a long, uncomfortable history of triggering exactly the kind of tit-for-tat escalation nobody can fully control once it starts. For weeks, this was the shape of the war. Airstrikes on one side, a naval chokehold on the other, and a slow economic squeeze measured in hundreds of millions of dollars a day. Then, in early May, the story took an unexpected turn, an attempt, at least, to soften the pressure rather than escalate it. On May 3rd, President Trump announced something called Project Freedom, an initiative meant to help civilian mariners navigate the strait via a southern route that avoided Iranian waters entirely. On paper, it looked like a way to keep global shipping moving, while still choking off Iran specifically, a more surgical version of the blockade. It didn't last 2 days. Just 2 days later, after Iranian attacks against the United Arab Emirates and Oman, and after reports of Saudi opposition to the U.S. using its airspace for the plan, Trump said Project Freedom was being paused at the request of Pakistan and other countries. Think about what that sentence actually contains. A U.S. military and diplomatic initiative unveiled with fanfare, shut down within 48 hours, because regional partners the U.S. needed for overflight rights didn't want to be pulled deeper into someone else's war. It's a small detail in the broader timeline, but it says something important. Even the country running the blockade didn't have a completely free hand in this region. Geography, alliances, and other nations' own war weariness were shaping decisions just as much as American military capability was. Then, in the middle of June, something happened that almost nobody watching the war in its opening weeks would have confidently predicted. It stopped. On June 17, 2026, the United States and Iran signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, committing both countries to terminating military operations. And it wasn't a vague ceasefire gesture. It had specific, almost transactional terms. President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a document explicitly declaring the removal of the U.S. naval blockade, alongside Iranian arrangements for safe passage of commercial vessels, at no charge, for a period of 60 days. 60 days. Not indefinite, not a permanent peace. A window, one where Iran offered guaranteed safe passage for ships, and the U.S., in exchange, pulled its blockade down. If the story ended there, it would already be a remarkable arc. A full-scale war, a total naval blockade of a G20 adjacent oil choke point, and then a negotiated stand-down within a couple of months. But it didn't end there, because by July, the blockade was back. According to reporting from the Jerusalem Post, on a Wednesday in mid-July, CENTCOM announced a fresh round of strikes against Iran, saying it had hit dozens of Iranian military targets near the Strait of Hormuz during a 7-hour operation involving American aircraft, drones, and naval vessels. And, in the same wave of statements, CENTCOM confirmed that the blockade itself had been reinstated. Whatever the 60-day arrangement was supposed to buy, whether it broke down over compliance, over some new provocation, or over politics on either side, it wasn't public information at the time these reports came out. What was public was the aftermath. A projectile reportedly exploded near a water and electricity facility on Iran's Kish Island. According to Iranian state media, and additional explosions were reported on Iran's Keshem Island by an outlet linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, though notably, the cause of those explosions had not yet been confirmed, and the instability wasn't staying confined to Iranian territory anymore. Kuwait's armed forces announced they were actively combating hostile aerial targets, missile and drone threats inside their own airspace, and shortly after, Bahrain's Interior Ministry reported rocket sirens sounding across the country. What had started as a bilateral confrontation between two countries was now, by summer, setting off alarms in Kuwait City and Manama, smaller Gulf states with no direct role in the original conflict, suddenly living under the same skies. By this second phase of the blockade, the strategic picture on the water had shifted too. With Hormuz effectively unreliable for weeks at a stretch, shippers had already started testing the one other route available to them. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, separating Yemen from Djibouti at the southern mouth of the Red Sea, normally functions as the primary alternative pathway for vessels trying to avoid Hormuz exposure altogether, letting a ship cross the Arabian Sea, thread through the Red Sea, and reach Europe or Asia via the Suez Canal instead. But that workaround has its own limits. When both choke points experience disruption at the same time, that standard routing option collapses, and the only remaining alternative becomes a full circumnavigation around the Cape of Good Hope, a voyage that reshapes the economics of practically every cargo shipment moving between the Middle East and its biggest customers. Even the traffic still trying to use Bab el-Mandeb was fluctuating day to day. On July 23, 2026, tracking firm Kepler recorded 32 commodity vessel crossings at that strait, up from 26 the day before. Small numbers, but they capture something important. A global shipping system in the middle of quietly, expensively rerouting itself around a war that had no clear end date. So where does that leave things, as of what's publicly documented? A war that opened with overwhelming American airpower, a naval blockade assembled in days, built around more than 10,000 troops and over a dozen warships, stepping into a shipping lane that had already seen traffic collapse by 97% and oil prices spike within days of the first strikes. A blockade that started with a perfect first day and slowly revealed real gaps. Dozens of ships eventually slipping through, according to Independent Maritime. Trackers, even as the U.S. military reported hundreds of millions of dollars a day in economic damage to Iran. A diplomatic attempt to ease the pressure that collapsed within 48 hours because of resistance from neighboring countries. Then, an actual negotiated stand-down and a real signed memorandum of understanding, and with a defined 60-day safe passage window. And then, weeks later, the blockade reinstated, strikes resuming, and the danger radius widening to include Gulf states that had spent the entire war trying to stay out of the blast zone. What isn't clear, what genuinely can't be answered from what's public, is why the June agreement fell apart. Was it a violation on one side? A political decision back in Washington or Tehran? A response to some other trigger event that hasn't been reported in detail? That gap in the record is where a lot of the real uncertainty in this story still lives. Wars that get solved through negotiated pauses and then reignite tend to have complicated reasons behind the collapse. And in this case, the public reporting available simply moves from blockade removed to blockade reinstated without fully explaining the space in between. There's also the deeper structural question hanging over all of it, one that has nothing to do with any single skirmish or announcement. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just another patch of ocean. It's one of a handful of places on Earth where a huge percentage of global oil and gas shipping is forced, by geography, through a bottleneck barely wide enough to keep tankers within sight of both Iranian and Omani coastline at once. And unlike some regional conflicts, the consequences here don't stay regional. Asian economies receive close to 90% of the crude oil and condensate that flows through the strait, which means a blockade 7,000 miles from Tokyo or Seoul can still show up as a price spike at a gas station in either city within days. That's part of why a 10,000 troop deployment and a maritime blockade matter beyond the immediate headlines. It's not just about Iran and the United States, it's about whether one of the world's most important trade arteries stays open, and on whose terms, and about how quickly the rest of the world's economy has to bend around a single stretch of contested water. What's confirmed, as of the most recent reporting available, is this. The blockade exists again. American forces are, once more, positioned to intercept and turn back vessels tied to Iranian ports. Strikes are continuing. Neighboring countries are intercepting missiles and drones over their own territory. Shipping companies are quietly rerouting cargo around 2 choke points at once instead of 1. And the 60-day safe passage arrangement that briefly ended the standoff in June has, for reasons not yet fully explained in public reporting, come apart. What isn't confirmed, what remains open, is how long this second phase lasts, whether it ends the same way the first one did, with a negotiated pause, or whether the pattern just keeps repeating. Blockade, strikes, a fragile deal, and then a return to blockade again. Congress's own research service, tracking this as an ongoing situation, hasn't closed the file. Wikipedia's own running account of the operation still lists its outcome, plainly, as ongoing, which leaves the story exactly where a story about a live, unresolved conflict should leave it. Not with a clean ending, but with the honest acknowledgement that nobody outside the rooms where these decisions are actually made, yet knows what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz.